You do not hide your fantasies because they are shameful. You hide them because they are true, too close, too dangerous to what you've built above them, too honest for the version of you that knows how to function, how to be loved, how to remain safe. Fantasies are not indulgences. They are confessions. They are the letters the unconscious writes to you in the language of disguise, because it knows the truth in its rawest form would be unlivable. So it twists, it filters. It distorts the message just enough that you can tolerate receiving it. But the desire is intact. The wish remains. The forbidden scene. The role you're not allowed to want. The image you return to, quietly, when no one is watching. Not because you are sick, not because you are deviant, but because fantasy is the only remaining space where truth is still allowed to want. You were told early what could not be said, what could not be shown, what must never be named. Desire without permission, need without shame, pleasure without guilt. So you split. You buried the part of you that longed. You silenced the voice that said, I want this. And in its place, you constructed someone else, someone bearable. But the unconscious remembers, and it does not care for politeness. It does not obey your identity. It has no loyalty to your roles, to your job title, to your virtue. It speaks in image, in tension, in patterns you don't control, in the fantasy that won't leave you alone. You think fantasy is escape. It isn't. It's return. Return to the original wound. Return to the moment when what you wanted became unsafe, when what you needed became a liability, when desire meant danger and danger meant loss. So the psyche invented another route, a symbolic route. It took the wish and reshaped it into a story that could be told in silence. That's what your fantasy is. A memory trying to find you again. A symptom dressed as pleasure. A repetition of what was never allowed to complete itself. Not to shock you, to restore you. But you don't let it speak. You dismiss it. You feel shame. You call it inappropriate, too much, ridiculous. You mistake it for perversion. You mistake it for pathology. But it is not corruption. It is your most secret intelligence. And the more you repress it, the more power it holds. Because what you exile in daylight will return in the dark, stronger, stranger, more insistent. This is not a warning. It's a truth. What is hidden becomes holy. Not because it is divine, but because it is yours. And you have spent a lifetime handing yourself away in the name of being accepted. Now, what you buried returns not to ruin you, but to be reclaimed. To feel your fantasies without flinching, this is not indulgence. It is initiation. Not into a life of chaos, but into a life where you are no longer ruled by denial. You do not need to act them out. You do not need to explain them. You do not need to justify what the unconscious already knows. You need only to feel, to stay with the image long enough to ask, what in me has never been touched by daylight? Because the truth is this: your fantasies are not distractions. They are roadmaps to the hunger you buried, to the permission you never received, to the pleasure you learned to fear, to the self unmitigated, unedited, unafraid. You were told to be modest. You were trained to be restrained. You were rewarded for being clean. But somewhere inside you, something remained wild. It found shelter in story. It found a pulse in scenes you can't describe without trembling. It found you again and again, when you thought you'd left it behind. That part of you is not broken. It's untouched. Your fantasy life is your unconscious, surviving. You've misunderstood its function. It's not there to tempt you, it's there to restore what you were forced to sacrifice. Agency, truth, pleasure, without punishment. Your freedom begins the moment you stop turning away. Not to act, not to confess, but to listen with the same reverence you would give to an ancient text. To read the fantasy not as a diagnosis, but as a mirror. It will not lie to you, but it will not speak in words. It will show you what you wanted, what you lost, what still lives. And if you have the courage to stay, to breathe in the presence of that hidden truth, then something opens. Not outside you, within you. A space, a choice, a path back to the self you never stopped being, beneath the mask of who you had to become. The unconscious does not invent your fantasies. It preserves them. It takes what was too raw, too much, too misaligned with the laws of your early world and renders it into metaphor. It translates desire into narrative, into structure, into scenes. And you misread them again and again as pleasure when what they really offer is coherence. A fantasy is never only about sex. It is about power, memory, containment. It is about the original scene where your will collided with someone else's absence. It is about the moment you first discovered that wanting could be dangerous. And so, your fantasy returns to that place again and again, not to repeat, but to rewrite, to give you control over the chaos, to let you direct the scene you once survived as an actor, with no lines. You do not know why it excites you, you only know it does. But if you look, truly look, you'll find something familiar, something that reminds you of who you were before repression took its first breath inside you. You want to be taken. You want to be watched. You want to be invisible. You want to be punished. You want to dissolve. You want to dominate what once left you helpless. These are not sins. They are signals. Signals that something inside you still burns, that the body remembers what the mind was trained to forget. But the world teaches you to sanitize, to translate the erotic into the productive, to sublimate it into work, into aesthetics, into culture. And sometimes that's necessary because civilization would fall if we all lived our instincts unfiltered. But sublimation is a double bind. It elevates desire while refusing to let it speak. It polishes what is meant to pulse, and the rawness, the truth of it gets lost in translation. You become refined, but not free, because the shame remains. The shame that was implanted before you could even name what you wanted. The shame that says, this part of you must be hidden. This part of you will cost you love. This part of you is too close to the animal to be allowed into the light. And yet, that part of you never dies. It simply finds other doors. It shows up in obsession, in jealousy, in the repetitive loop of fantasies that both seduce and disturb you, not because you are failing, but because you have not yet turned to face the one inside you who still carries the full map of your hunger. What you hide is not what corrupts you. It's what keeps you human. You were taught to fear your erotic life, to regulate it, to package it for others, to keep it polite, or performative, or dormant. But that is not integration. That is exile. And what is exiled returns. In dreams, in compulsions, in the moment your mask slips, and the truth surges forward, raw and unedited. The erotic is not an accessory. It is the root of your psychic life, the drive that threads through creativity, aggression, attachment, destruction. To understand it is not to reduce it to sex, but to recognize that all energy begins in the body, and all repression begins with the denial of that truth. Your fantasies are not obstacles to be overcome. They are stories in need of context. They are riddles the psyche gives you because it knows the conscious mind could not bear the full memory. And this is the task: to stay with them, to feel them, not to act them out, not to confess them as shame, but to track their architecture to see what early wound, what early rejection, what early touch they orbit. And when you find that center, you don't fix it. You witness it. You let it live in you. You speak to it. I see you. I know where you came from. I'm not afraid of you anymore. That is how the fantasy becomes integrated. Not repressed, not sanctified, but understood. And what is understood loses its compulsion. You stop needing the fantasy to manage your pain. You stop fearing what it says about you. You stop hiding behind the shame it once produced, because you now know your fantasy was never the problem. Your silence was. Now, into the structure of neurosis, not as a diagnosis, but as architecture. The fantasy was never isolated. It was part of a larger machinery. Repression did not begin with sex. It began with the unbearable. The too vivid, the too loud, the too muchness of being alive in a world that demanded you be smaller. In exchange for safety, you gave up fragments of yourself. And what you received in return was conflict. Chronic, unresolvable, exquisitely human. This is neurosis. Neurosis is not madness. It is not illness. It is not weakness. It is intelligence turned inward against itself. It is the price you pay for becoming acceptable, for surviving your earliest compromises, for belonging in a world where parts of you had to die quietly, invisibly, so you could stay close to love. A neurotic symptom is not noise. It is memory, frozen, symbolic. It repeats what you could not complete. It stages, again and again, the scene you once survived but never understood. You say, I don't know why I do this. You say, I always end up here. You say, something in me won't let go. That something has a name, not pathology structure. Because the unconscious does not forget. It does not let go. It does not move on. It waits patiently for your awareness to catch up. Your anxiety is a protest. Your depression is refusal. Your compulsions are choreography, the dance you do to keep the unbearable at bay. But you don't see this. You call it malfunction. You treat it as a bug in the code. You try to fix it, optimize it, sedate it. But what if the symptom isn't dysfunction? What if the symptom is truth? Truth that your conscious mind cannot yet hold. Truth that was once punished. Truth that, when it surfaced as a child, was met with withdrawal, confusion, or silence. And so it burrowed. It became something else. A fear, a twitch, a pattern. This is the logic of repression. It does not delete. It converts. And so your mind becomes a layered structure. On top, the ego clean, coherent, aligned with reality. Beneath it, the id, hungry, chaotic, filled with drives that have no language. And between them, the superego, the punisher, the judge, the internalized parent who keeps you in line. And you, the person, are caught in this system, torn, between what you want, what you're allowed to want, and what you pretend you no longer want. This is the friction of being human, and neurosis is its smoke. You can't heal it by bypassing it. You can't solve it with affirmation. You can't remove it without also removing yourself. Because the symptom is not other than you. It is you in disguise. It is the version of you that obeyed too long. It is your truth, wrapped in conflict, waiting to be reowned. But reowning it is dangerous. Not to your life, to your structure. Because it means questioning the very self that has kept you safe. The self that says, I'm fine. The self that says, I don't need anything. The self that says, it wasn't that bad. And beneath that self, the original one. The one you buried, so no one could use it against you again. The one who still wants, still rages, still grieves, still dreams. This is not regression. This is reclamation. You do not regress by meeting the child within. You regress by pretending you never were one. You regress by turning your symptoms into enemies, by silencing the voices inside you that never stop telling the truth. You are not broken. You are organized around what you had to hide. And now you are waking up, not into freedom, but into contradiction. Because freedom is not the absence of repression. It is the capacity to live with tension without being torn apart by it. It is the ability to say, yes, I want this, and it scares me. Yes, I am angry, and I love them. Yes, I feel shame, and I will not obey it today. That is maturity. That is individuation. That is the labor of becoming whole in a psyche built around division. You don't need to be consistent. You need to be congruent. Not seamless, but true. And your truth will be messy. It will be contradictory. It will offend the internal voices that demanded perfection. But if you stay long enough in the presence of what you once exiled, you will notice something change. The symptom softens. The fantasy reveals. The shame recedes. The self, not the performed one, but the real one, begins to breathe again. And that breath, quiet, fragile, unwavering, that is the beginning of freedom. We descend now into the fractured architecture of the false self, a construction born not of vanity but of survival, a shell made of mirrors, built to please, to manage, to stay wanted, and underneath it the unformed cry of the original self, the self that felt everything too much, too soon. To continue this journey is not to arrive. It is to remove layer by careful layer every adaptation that cost you your truth. The false self is not a lie. It is a solution. You created it when truth became unlivable, when wanting became dangerous, when every authentic impulse was met with withdrawal, rejection, ridicule. So you studied the room. You read the silences. You adjusted not once, but constantly, until the adjustment became identity, until performance felt like safety, until you forgot there was anything beneath it. This is the tragedy of intelligence. You became exactly what they needed, and in doing so, you lost access to what you are. You smile when you're expected to. You nod when you disagree. You laugh at the jokes that bruise you. You offer more than you have. You apologize for simply having limits. And no one notices, because you are so good at disappearing without leaving the room. This is not inauthenticity. It is trauma. It is the body's compromise with a world that punished your original form. And the punishment wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was subtle, a sigh, a flinch, a moment of disconnection when you spoke too loudly, cried too long, needed too much. You learned that to be accepted, you must amputate parts of yourself. So you did, with grace, with brilliance, with precision. And now, you don't know where the performance ends and where you begin. You have a self, but it is curated. You have desires, but they're edited. You have a voice, but it speaks in ways that won't get you punished. And you call this adulthood. But somewhere, in the dark, the original self still waits. It doesn't want revenge. It wants reintegration, not to destroy the false self, but to breathe again underneath it. Because the false self served you. It kept you alive. But you are not a child anymore. You do not need to be palatable to exist. You can want. You can contradict. You can grieve what you gave up to survive. You can remember, not just the facts, the feeling, the ache of never being held where it mattered, the fracture of having to be charming when you needed to be seen, the silence that grew inside you every time your truth cost you connection. This remembering is not nostalgia. It is reassembly. Because trauma does not just wound, it fragments, it breaks time. It slices memory into pieces that don't speak to each other. It isolates feeling from narrative, sensation from speech. You don't forget because you're weak. You forget because remembering would have been too much. And yet, the body remembers. The body dreams. The body repeats. Not because it's broken, because it's loyal. It brings you back again and again to the scene of the original loss, hoping you'll stay this time, hoping you'll see. That's the invitation. Not to go back, but to go down, to feel what was once unfelt, to hold what was once unbearable, to bring coherence to what was once severed. This is not healing as cure. This is integration as ethic. Not to eliminate the past, but to carry it with dignity. To say, yes, that was me. Yes, that hurt. Yes, I still move through the world like I did when I was 5, hypervigilant, pleasing, always scanning. But I see it now, and I choose differently. This choosing is slow. It is imperfect. It is the practice of becoming whole in a culture that profits from your fragmentation. But each time you refuse to perform, each time you speak instead of adapt, each time you stay when you want to vanish, you reclaim a piece of your selfhood. And eventually, you begin to feel solid again. Not rigid real, not armored rooted. And when you meet others from that place, you are no longer trading performances. You are no longer two masks dancing around emptiness. You are two truths, imperfect, afraid, luminous, meeting at last without disguise. That is intimacy. Not the absence of fear, but the absence of pretending, and only the integrated self can tolerate it. We continue into the slow, daily labor, not of becoming, but of undoing, of peeling back the layers of compromise that once kept you safe and now keep you silent. This is not a transformation that shouts. It does not happen on stages or in moments of triumph. It unfolds in kitchens, in hallways, in text messages unsent, in the decision to not explain yourself one more time. We begin now with the simplest and hardest of acts, to live in truth when no one is watching. You will not be rewarded for this. Do not confuse truth with glory. The moment you stop pretending, the applause stops too. People loved your performance. They loved the version of you that never asked for too much, that smiled on cue, that offered comfort instead of confrontation, that made them feel better about themselves. Now you are inconvenient. You ask different questions. You say no without apologizing. You don't rush to reassure. You don't agree just to keep the peace. You are not harder. You are simply here unsoftened by the need to be liked. And this is where the real work begins. The fantasy of healing is that it ends with arrival, a new self, proud and gleaming, a life built cleanly atop ruins. But the reality is much quieter, less like flight, more like staying. Staying with yourself when the guilt rises. Staying when you disappoint someone. Staying when you want to collapse into the old shape. Staying with the feeling instead of managing the optics. Because this is not about expression. This is about containment. To contain your truth does not mean to hide it. It means to hold it. To live it without spilling. Without forcing. Without turning it into theater. You begin to tell the truth not to provoke, but because anything else tastes like dust. You speak less often. You say more. You stop performing vulnerability as a way to be loved. You stop confessing to avoid conflict. You stop making others responsible for how deeply you feel. And in this stillness, you meet something terrifying. Your own self-responsibility. You realize you cannot outsource your safety. Not to approval, not to intimacy, not even to love. You are no longer interested in being understood by everyone. You are interested in staying intact. This integrity costs you. You lose roles, you lose access. You lose the easy comfort of being mirrored back through the gaze of others. But what you gain is harder to name. It's in your spine, in your breath, in the way you no longer abandon yourself in the middle of a conversation. It's in the way you can say, "This is true for me," without needing consensus. You stop convincing. You stop explaining. You stop shrinking your knowing just to keep the temperature down. You let silence do what it does. You let people feel what they feel. You don't intervene to manage their disappointment. Because every time you lie even a little, you reinforce the belief that your truth is a threat. And you are done with that. This is not rebellion. This is restoration. To walk into a room and not become who they need you to be, this is sacred. To say what you mean and not wait to be rescued from the consequences, this is adulthood. To stay with your discomfort until it becomes information instead of emergency, this is integration. You don't become better, you become congruent. And congruence is what freedom actually feels like. Not light, not perfect, not pain-free, just honest, consistent. Yours. We are almost at the marrow. The fantasy has been traced, the wound unwrapped, the false self illuminated. What remains now is the life that rises when performance ends. Quiet, clear, unshakable. We arrive at the closing movement, the slow re-entry into ordinary life, seen now through a different lens. A life no longer shaped by performance, but by quiet presence. No longer organized around absence, but around fidelity to the self that once had to go silent. This is not transcendence. It is texture. A life where you stop chasing intensity and begin to notice meaning in pauses, in restraint, in the simple dignity of not leaving yourself again. You are not trying to become someone else anymore. You are not fixing. You are not chasing peak states. You are remembering, not with your mind, with your body. You move through the world differently now. You're slower. You're less interested in control. You feel the shape of your limits not as failures, but as form. You feel desire rise not as fire, but as signal. You don't rush to fulfill it. You let it inform you. Desire becomes less about acquisition, more about attention. You no longer ask, how do I get what I want? You ask, who do I become when I want something deeply, and stay with that feeling without betraying it? That is reverence, not for fantasy, but for reality. You don't turn your longing into a performance. You don't perform healing. You live, unarmored, aware, unapologetic, in the quietest way possible. You make choices from alignment now, not from fear. You don't barter with your intuition. You don't collapse into old roles when tension rises. You just breathe, and you stay. And the staying changes everything. This is not something you post. This is not something people see. But you feel it. You feel it when you say no without guilt. When you say yes without bracing. When you ask for what you want, not to test your worth, but to honor it. This is what it means to live symbolically. To understand that every small choice is a vote for coherence. That you are always either reinforcing the split or repairing it. And now, you repair. You repair by not abandoning your body when emotion arises. You repair by not silencing yourself when your truth doesn't fit the script. You repair by not treating your sensitivity as a problem to be solved. You repair by staying close to your own pulse, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Especially then, because now you know you are not here to be acceptable. You are here to be whole. You don't need to be decoded. You don't need to be agreed with. You need only to be integrated, aligned, attuned to your inner authority, the one that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't seduce, the one that just knows. And from that place you begin to live, not louder, not bigger, but deeper. You begin to notice the quiet poetry of limits, the grace of restraint, the sacred weight of knowing when not to speak, when not to chase, when not to offer yourself to what cannot meet you. You don't need every story to end in connection. Sometimes, the most intimate thing you can do is leave. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay, not for them, but for the part of you that once had no witness. You live differently now, not in performance, but in presence. You feel everything, and you stay. That is freedom. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of self-betrayal. You are not light all the time. You are not healed in the way they promised. But you are here, and you no longer abandon yourself to be loved. That is the beginning, and it never ends. You waited a long time for someone to give you permission, to want, to rest, to feel, to not know, to stop performing. You waited for a mirror that wouldn't flinch, for a voice that would say, yes, even this belongs. But no one came, or if they did, you were too practiced in self-erasure to recognize them. So now, you stop waiting. You stop waiting to be chosen before you choose yourself. You stop waiting to be understood before you speak plainly. You stop waiting to be fixed before you feel worthy of standing still. You turn inward not to disappear, but to begin again from truth. No climax, no great unveiling, just this, a single breath where you don't abandon yourself. A moment where the old reflex to lie, to shrink, to disappear, passes through you like a wave, and you stay. You stay with the tension. You stay with the tenderness. You stay with the part of you that still shakes in the presence of love, because love once meant loss, and in staying you return, not to who you were, but to the one who never left, the one who went quiet, the one who dreamed, the one who kept the key beneath the ruins. You lift them out now not with force, but with fidelity, and you walk, not forward, not upward, just with yourself, with your shadow, with your shame, with the sacred, furious, unfinished business of being human. And that is the end, not because the work is done, but because you are no longer pretending that you're not already whole even in pieces.